The process of investing in Western European notions of civilization, however, had consequences. First, it placed limits on the historical narratives that could be told about the country's past. Greece could legitimately claim two connections to antiquity, one Hellenic and one Roman or Byzantine. In practice, the Hellenic was emphasized and the Roman was de-emphasized. One contributing factor to this choice was the ascendancy of Greek neoclassicism in arts and letters. Another probably more significant factor, however, is geocultural in nature. Placing too much emphasis on Greece's claim to Roman inheritance meant disputing dominant Western powers, dominant Western narratives of cultural patrimony by raising the uncomfortable fact that the Roman Empire was not always Latin-speaking, that it was in fact for nearly 1,000 years, nearly a millennium, Greek-speaking and Eastern exclusively. The other consequence of adopting a Western European concept of civilization is that it meant placing an emphasis on past brilliance of Hellenic civilization as a promise for future success. So the past triumphs of classical Athenian society were a promise that Athenian democracy in the future would evolve along similar brilliant lines. Greek identity, in other words, became something you were born into, not something you acquired. A citizen's Greekness was defined in terms of claims to a Hellenic past, and as a result, people were born into Greekness instead of acquiring it. This posed a problem in post-revolutionary Greece because many of the population groups that were incorporated into the Greek state, including some that played significant roles in the Greek Revolution, such as the Arvanites and the Armani, or Vlachs, though Orthodox, spoke languages that were very different from Greek. And here I'm showing four noted Arvanites, three noted Arvanites, and one noted Vlach, who played major roles in the Greek Revolution. This necessitated the construction of narratives of Hellenic heritage that predated the acquisition of different linguistic habits. Hence, the Arvanites, from southern Albania originally, were deemed heirs of the ancient Illyrians, and the Vlachs were declared to be descendants of the ancient Thracians. The way that the notion of politismos has been constructed in Greece has also had repercussions for the current immigration crisis. As you all well know, for decades Greece was a country that produced immigrants, beginning in about 1893 and continuing through the early 1930s and into the 1970s actually. Hundreds of thousands of Greeks left Greece to go to the US, to Australia, to Germany, to Canada, and elsewhere in search of economic opportunity and social mobility. The Greek government and the country's political classes even went so far as to encourage immigration, signing agreements with countries that facilitated the movement of Greeks abroad. Greek immigration had two benefits. It reduced social and economic pressure within the country, and it resulted in a steady flow of remittances to Greece, money sent back from immigrants abroad to families at home, which bolstered both the economy and foreign exchange reserves. Beginning in the early 1990s, however, the state of affairs changed. It had been 20 years since Greece had sent significant numbers of immigrants abroad. The economy had improved substantially since the 1970s, and European integration was proceeding smoothly with the signing of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. The social and economic pressures that drove immigration were much less prominent. Then, the Eastern Bloc fell, making it possible for large numbers of diasporic Greeks to return to the homeland. The first wave of immigration to Greece began as ethnic Greeks and others from Albania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and the Black Sea areas of the former Soviet Union began to migrate to the homeland in large numbers. In spite of often significant cultural differences, the Greek cohorts of this immigration wave were fairly well received since they generally arrived legally and represented lost branches of Greek politismos. Non-Greek components, however, were held at more of a distance. Fairly or unfairly, these immigrants were often linked to perceived increases in crime, and many ignored the contributions that they made to the economy, where immigrants fueled the construction boom in Athens and provided much-needed agricultural labor in rural areas. About the time that Greeks were beginning to become accustomed to the first wave of immigrants, a second wave started to arrive. This time featuring immigrants from the Middle East, from Asia, from Africa, in addition to a continued flow from Eastern Europe. This wave of immigrants has faced even more problems becoming integrated into Greek society as a result of more substantial religious and cultural differences. As a result, social tensions surrounding immigration have continued to arise. There's been more and more tension. Additionally, the vast majority of these immigrants have arrived illegally as opposed to legally, and their presence is creating substantial legal and administrative issues. Today, Greece houses somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million immigrants. Athens by itself has approximately 700,000 immigrants. And we're talking about, in other words, 1 in 11 inhabitants of Greece being an immigrant. These numbers are very substantial. I want to make sure we're clear, though, that they're not unprecedented. Austria and Spain have very similar numbers of immigrants per capita, and they have very similar percentages of non-European Union citizens among their immigrants. So if you look at the statistics, there really are a couple other European Union countries at least, if not a handful, that are facing similar immigration dilemmas as Greece is facing. I don't want to minimize the social and cultural hardships that many Greeks face as a result of these waves of immigration. In many sectors of the economy, working-class Greeks found themselves either replaced by cheaper immigrant labor or forced to accept lower wages. Additionally, immigration dramatically changed the character of many Athenian neighborhoods, prompting flight to the suburbs by those who have resources, and resentment on the parts of those who are forced to remain behind. How many of you have been to Ammonia Square? Most of you. As recently as 15 years ago, it was a drastically different place. I mean, it still felt like a residential neighborhood there, where you had people, normal, everyday people, who were living in the apartments surrounding Ammonia, living upstairs. In the past 15 years, there's been dramatic flight out of that neighborhood and out of the neighborhoods immediately to the north, Kypseli being one of them. And it's resulted in traditional Athenian neighborhoods taking on a dramatically different character, and a lot of people have been left behind, and they feel very challenged by the circumstances, rightly or wrongly. And I think there's some degree of right and some degree of wrong by the circumstances that they find themselves in. It's really, really weakened the sense of community that Greeks in these areas feel, and it's defamiliarized the once familiar. I mean, up until recently, I have an old uncle who was 80 years old and used to hop on the bus and go down to Ammonia. It was his hangout. And now, forget it. You wouldn't think about doing that in 100 years. It's also getting to the point where it becomes a little more difficult for him to do that. Anyway.